Hello and welcome to the final day of Risk Awareness Week. My name is Graeme Keith. This is the third of my workshops in the week. What I've been talking about this week is the two pillars of my approach to risk management, namely causal mapping and uncertainty analysis, the mathematics, the probability, the statistics that go into that. And as I explained in the first workshop, what I'm trying to do with combining those two things, causal mapping is an incredibly powerful, intuitive methodology, but it's strangely unrigorous in the way that it's formulated. There's a lot of flexibility to it. There's a lot of plasticity. It's quite a sort of subjective process, but it very much sort of draws on the intuition that people bring to a table. So it's a very powerful tool for getting people around a table, agreeing on things, drawing expertise and understanding out of subject matter experts and stakeholders who are present. And what I then try to do is to sort of firm up the rigor of causal analysis with uncertainty theory, with uncertainty modeling, stochastic modeling, the mathematical techniques there. Because they are incredibly non-intuitive. They're very difficult. They're notoriously difficult for people to sort of generate intuition about. But in a sense, the intuitive part we look after with the causal mapping. On the other hand, the mathematical methods are incredibly rigorous. There's a very well-established, rigorous tradition for those methods. And by combining those two, what I hope to achieve is to have a method that can bring everyone around the table, get everyone involved in putting a model together, but at the same time making sure that there's honesty, integrity, a very solid link to reality by bringing the mathematical machinery, which is essentially saying, look, there's data here. We can't ignore the data. We have to tell a story with our model, but we have to make sure that that model hangs together with the data and what we can observe out there. So that combination, I think, is very powerful. And what I hope I've demonstrated in the first two lectures is how the causal mapping is able to bring people together to create a model that is pretty much most of the way there in terms of what people need to understand how the model works. So what's in the model, what's outside the model, what are the basic assumptions, what are the data that we're using to condition the model, how, to the extent that people can understand that, are we doing that? And then the final step, the mathematics, the sort of getting your feet wet in the sort of nitty-gritty detail of the mathematics, that's sort of backgrounded a little bit. That's not to say that it's less important or that it's ignored, but it's just, we don't need every single stakeholder to be involved in that because there's so much sort of understanding and ownership that's generated by the causal model. Now, the first two workshops were introducing these concepts in general, and then working through a specific example of causal mapping from the time that I had in the oil and gas industry. What I want to do today is take the causal mapping and take it a step further and show you a little bit about how the uncertainty mathematics works in relation to the causal mapping. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the mathematics. I'm still going to background that and sort of do that quietly off to the side. But what I want to be able to do is to show you how that mathematics generates results that you can use to make decisions. Now, at the end of this presentation, I'm going to say, okay, that I think is risk management. I'm going to talk about how this is risk management, if you see what I mean. But at the same time, I'm going to say, all right, well, if we take a sort of risk management, a traditional risk management approach to this, a sort of heat map based approach to this, what can I do with that? What are the same decisions, the same sort of calculations that I'm talking about in my approach? How do they look in a traditional approach there? And we'll see how the traditional approach maps up against the approach that I'm presenting in these workshops. So let's just dive straight in. I'm going to use the example that I introduced in my first workshop, excuse me, which is the example of me cycling to work. So this isn't me, this is a stock picture, but this is where I cycle to work. This is the animal park north of Copenhagen, very beautiful expanse of land north of Copenhagen that I cycle through on my way to work. And I've made a very simple model because honestly, I'm a bit of a nerd. So when I cycle to work, I've been recording how long it takes me, and I've been recording the events that take place on the way to work so that I can build this model. It doesn't take long, it doesn't take much work, and I go to work for a few weeks, and I have actually a pretty solid data set for building a very nice toy example model, and that's what I'm going to walk you through now. So the very simplest way of doing this is to say, well, look, what I'm interested in is the time I get to work, and the decision I have to make is what time I leave for work. And obviously, the piece of information that I need to gather some data on is how long it takes me to get to work. Now, I work for myself now, which is very nice, but let's just say that I had a really evil boss who would tell me off if I was late and would give me a right sound thrashing if I was more than 15 minutes late. So those are the sort of parameters that we're working with, and I'll explain a little bit how we use those in a minute. Now, the simplest way of doing this is simply to record a bunch of travel times. Obviously, I'm interested in the average time, a sort of sense of how long it takes me to get there. I'm actually more interested in what time I need to leave in order that I'm not late more than, say, once a week, and that if I am late, I'm not more than a few minutes late. So I want to sort of set that departure time. Obviously, there's a pressure on the other end, which is that we have to get the family out and kids to school and so on. So I'd like to have as much time as possible at the other end. So there's sort of an optimization issue there. Now, so one way of doing this is just to record the times and to do the statistics on that, find out, okay, what's the P20, we call it, the point at which 20% of the time I would be late. And I can do that. But actually what I want to do now is to show you a slightly more sophisticated model, which is probably a little bit overkill for the cycling example, but actually maps very nicely. It's a very powerful analogy to a lot of the kind of modeling that I do in my professional work when I'm working with company strategy, when I'm working with enterprise risk management, and when I'm working with project management, and also sort of day-to-day decision making, just sort of quantitative support for decision making. So this model is, as I said, it's a toy model. What I'm about to do is probably a bit of overkill in terms of what time I need to leave for work. But it illustrates a lot of those points very nicely. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that travel time, I'm going to try and split it out, try to understand what's influencing the travel time. This is the causal analysis part of this. And I'm actually going to skip over a fair amount of work here because there's quite a lot of work in a causal analysis. It's incredibly insightful work. It's very revealing. Always when we do these exercises, we do these analyses in order to be able to make models. But I think a lot of the value of these models actually comes from this process of trying to understand what are the influences here, what's making a difference, how do those influences, how do those parameters and variables, how do they relate to each other? What's the causal relations of each to each other, and what's the mathematical relation that we get to a little bit later. So the question is, what affects my travel time? I live in Denmark. It's quite a windy country. It's not a coincidence that we're the first country to be self-supplying in by wind power. It's pretty windy here. So wind is obviously a big thing, and you feel that on your body when you're cycling to work. You also feel on your body how you feel in the morning. You get up sometimes, I don't know, maybe I was out late the night before, maybe I didn't sleep so well. I have 3 kids, so it's quite often that I don't sleep that well. So you know, your physical form, how much power you can generate, how fast you can move the bike, whatever the wind, that's clearly a factor as well. And then I have these sort of event risks. I have the things that can go wrong for me. So maybe I puncture, maybe my chain falls off, maybe I destroy my chain wheel, which I do occasionally. Various things can go wrong, and then obviously that has some sort of a delay that I just add into the travel time. Something that happens to me more often than it ought, I think, is that I bump into people on the way. Nothing wrong with bumping into people on the way, but I'm a bit of a chatterbox. I like talking to people. So when I meet people on the route to work, sometimes I stop and chat, and I can take longer than it really ought to, and that can actually really delay me on the way to work. So there's this sort of chance encounter risk here that I also need to take into account. And I can keep going back with these things. I can keep going. So what's, you know, the chance of meeting that's you know, that's depending on route and things like that. I'm just going to assume I'm taking the same route every day. I could think about things like maintenance with the bike. I could think about last time I had, you know, had it fixed, had it checked. Wind, obviously, there's meteorological things. I can go back, and I can also make these things more or less granular, and that's what I mean by there's been quite a lot of work around this. I mean, one thing is the sort of brainstorming process where you identify all of the factors and influences, but there's actually a lot of work to be done in terms of arranging them, making sure that the causal relations are correct, that these arrows have a meaningful direction, that we're not just describing relationships, that we're actually describing an intervention. So if I go in and I change one of these things, then it actually has an effect either directly on the thing that it's pointing towards, or on the probability distribution of the thing that it's pointing towards. And then there's a granularity issue that says, you know, I could lump these things together in something I might call speed, say, and I could lump these things together in something I call delays. But if I did that, then I'd lose some information. So that sort of brings me nicely on to the next point, which is why would I do this? And actually, the reason I do this, there's several reasons. One is hopefully, not always, but hopefully it will give me a better model. I say hopefully. I think you can analyze whether or not it gives you a better model. In some cases, not all cases, it gives you a better model. Especially if the data is a little bit sparse. If your data is a little bit sparse, I only have 20 or 30 travel times. I've only done this for a month, say. That's not a huge amount of data to be making what is actually quite a complicated probability distribution. So splitting these things out, what it allows me to do is bring interesting new information. So for example, I can look at how wind speed and form relate to each other. I can make a physical model of that. That allows me to bring in knowledge that I have of the physics of cycling to work. And that allows me to do more with less in terms of data. There's a sort of quite contrary way of looking at it, which is to say that if you split things out, you have more parameters in your model, and then you need more data in order to fit those parameters. So if you're not doing that kind of physical modeling, then there is also a danger with splitting these things out. And again, we come back to this issue about granularity, setting the level of detail that is appropriate for the decision that you have to make, but is also appropriate for the data that you have and the amount of data you have. One of the other reasons for doing this is that it allows us to look at triggers. It allows us to say, okay, it turns out the wind's fairly important here. So what I can do is I can just say, well, all right, just suck it up. Wind's important. I just have to leave early every day because it might be windy. But then that's a bit dark because I know I can take my phone out and look at the phone and I can see what the wind direction is and I can see what the wind speed is. So I can actually adjust my leaving time according to what the wind is. Now, in order to be able to model that, I need to have wind in my model. And that's one of the powerful reasons for doing this, is that it offers us opportunities to introduce mitigation measures, policies, sort of respond and react type situations, and by having them in the model, we can model what things look like in a kind of respond and react situation, and I'll get back to that in a couple of slides. So mathematically we call this conditioning. Basically it says, my basic model, these are all random variables, they're all uncertain. I don't really, I know what the range could be, I know roughly what that distribution looks like, but I don't know for certain what it's going to be one day to the next. But if I have some extra information, I can go in and fix one of those things, and then I can rerun the model, and then I can make more informed choices and decisions on a sort of operational basis. So that's another reason for making this split out. Okay, so just crashing straight into it. This is the sort of model that you get in a sort of first pass, sitting in a room together with a bunch of people, we sort of put the model together. But what you find is that when you go back and start working with the mathematics in a little more detail, you shift things around. And there's a process that we've introduced that I think I talked about last in the first workshop, which is a sort of iterative process where we go backwards and forwards between the models and just checking that the models that everyone's okay with it. And this is all part of this very, very important, crucial issue, that everyone around the table is comfortable with the model and has a sense of ownership with the model, even if they don't necessarily want to engage with the mathematics in a great deal of detail. So this is the model that we arrive at after a little bit of massage and a little bit of work. You can see I've lumped things together in speed and lumped things in delay, but that's just because it's a convenient way of calculating travel time. To calculate the travel time from the average speed without delays, excuse me, and then I factor in the delays. Now, something that's quite interesting here, and again, this is something you feel intuitively when you're cycling around, is that traffic lights are an incredibly important issue here. And I hadn't put traffic lights into this thing because they're actually not that interesting to me in a sort of causal mapping sense, because I can't do anything about it. I don't have a video feed from the first set of traffic lights, and actually the traffic lights I encounter are relatively independent, so even if they did, it wouldn't affect the later ones. So I can't do anything about traffic lights. I can't observe them. I can't modify my behavior on the basis of an observation of them. So in this model, the traffic lights are just wrapped up in travel time. That's just something that these things are influencing travel time, but there's other things that are here too. I've split them out here because they're part of the way that I constructed this model, and they're sort of interesting to look at relative to wind and things like that. But generally speaking, I try as much as possible to make sure that the things that I include in my model are either something that we can observe, either for monitoring or for sort of policy driving, react and respond type situations. Or they are the things that I'm changing, the decisions, or there are objectives, or they're primary uncertainties that we want to we want to understand and look at, or they're the things that we have data for that we need to bring into condition the model. And if they're not one of those four things, then I tend to try to leave them out of the model. But sometimes, as much for political reasons than anything else, or just to make people feel comfortable with the model, it's worth to sort of have them in at some level, like I've done with the traffic lights here. Okay, so just running very quickly through the model, I've popped departure time up at the top here now. That's the key decision here. I have my objective here, which is the arrival time. And actually my objective, that's the thing that I measure, but actually my objective is to not be late more than once a week, to keep that to a minimum, and to try and keep, say, being more than 15 minutes late down to, I don't know, once a year or something like that, very low rate, so I don't have to put up with being savagely thrashed by my manager. Travel time is clearly the important thing. A bunch of things that are going into that. Basically, how fast do I cycle and do I get delayed? And then separating out the sort of unusual delays from the everyday delays, the traffic delays here. Speed I'm splitting out into wind, and wind is obviously a function of its speed and its direction. So it's the wind in the direction I'm traveling. And it's also a function of my form. And what I'm saying is that my form is basically pretty constant unless I've done something silly the night before. Maybe I've been out in the town, or maybe I'm a little bit hungover, or maybe I haven't slept. And actually these days, this thing doesn't happen so very often, hardly ever happens at all. And this thing where I don't get to sleep that much happens an awful lot. So what I'm going to do, the way I sort of put this model together is that, as I say, I'm going to make a physical model, and modeling the physics of me generating power and cycling against some sort of level of wind. I've also got a little bit of gradient in there, a little bit of rolling resistance, but not that important. And that model has a bunch of parameters that I can either try to calculate physically, or I can use the data that I have to try and condition. And that's essentially what I do. And what I do is I look at these situations. I look at the situation. I say, okay, I have 4 situations. I have, I'm fully rested and went to bed early and everything's fine. I didn't get some sleep. That happens quite a bit. I was out in the town and did get sleep. I was out in the town, didn't get sleep. Those don't happen that very often, but I have a little bit of data. And then what I do is I simply fit the missing parameters in the model by using the data and the physical model and the wind data. The wind data is coming from my historical data. I'm actually measuring the wind, but in terms of my forward model, there's an enormous amount of data on wind speed and direction, particularly in Denmark. We're very strong on wind, have been for a long time. So that's easily looked up, and this was the work of 20 minutes to put these distributions together. Now on the delay side, just very simply, does the bike fail? And then I have data on how long it takes me to fix the bike in the cases where it fails. And I could split this out into different kinds of failures that require me to take it to the bike shop and borrow a bike versus failures that require me to just get off the bike and fix it. But I've lumped them all together, and then the distribution is a little bit more complex because they're lumped all together. And again, modeling choice, we can figure that out. It depends whether we want to do something about it, whether we want to be modeling and observing, reacting and responding, or whether this is just helping to get the statistics right. And the same going on with the meeting here. Now, this is a lot of the conversation. I'm talking a lot about this cycling example as if it's some big project that you do in your company, and in a sense it is, because there's a lot of there's a very powerful analogy between this sort of model and, say, a project model. So in a project model, if you imagine, we even talk about having a sort of tailwind on a project or a headwind in a project because of maybe its complexity or external influences that are sort of holding us back. These aren't sort of happens or don't happen type things. They're things, there's always a certain amount of headwind or a certain amount of tailwind in a project, and it's a sort of continuous range of resistance, if you like. And then you've got the sort of internal things, so how good the team is, the experience of the team, the processes that are in place, that sort of thing. And essentially, and again, it's not an all or nothing. It's not an on or off thing. It's a sort of something that you can measure. You can split out into various sort of categories and understand how it's affecting you. So these are the sort of range uncertainties that affect essentially how quickly you're getting things done, and that tells you how quickly you get your project finished. And then you have the sort of the things that go wrong, the digging up some fantastic archaeological sites that needs to be studied for 2 years, or something going wrong, a company going bankrupt or something like that, the sort of individual events. So the structure of this, it's a very, very simple model, but the structure of this actually maps very closely to, for example, a project model. It also maps very closely to the kind of strategic modeling I do. So in that case, the wind might be, for example, something like commodity price. So if I'm doing strategy for an oil company, then the price can be high, or the price can go high, the price can be low or go low, and obviously that will have an effect on my overall outcome. I can have, again, more or less efficiency in terms of exploiting the resources that I have. There's a sort of internal piece, and then of course, obviously there are external risks, and there's lots of those as well. One of the beauties of causal mappings is incredibly scalable. We can use it for very simple problems like this, and we can use it for very big problems, very big analyses. But even when we're doing very big analyses, because of this very sort of flexible notion of causality that allows us to sort of group things together and play a lot with granularity, one thing is that we are able to choose the level of granularity to suit the decisions and the data, but the other is that we can play with the granularity in order to be able to communicate things. So in a strategy model, for example, your top level strategy model might not be that much more complicated than this, and you'll have lumped a bunch of things together into sort of external factors, internal factors, safety risks, maybe environmental risks, whatever. And then you can split those things out, and you split those things out, and that's very nice because it allows you to move up and down through an organization, to talk at an executive level and talk about the sort of big picture things and the individual things that influence that, and also how policy decisions can sort of filter down, cascade out through a lot of different levels and affect the overall results. But then when you go down through the organization in order to sort of gather data and gather understanding for each of those individual components, you can roll those maps out and you can look at things in a little bit more detail. So it's a very powerful process like that when you get used to using it. Okay. Back to the cycling model. Obviously, what I need to do here is, because it's a statistical model, it's a probabilistic model, I'm not going to say the bike will fail or the bike won't fail. I'm going to say there's a certain probability that the bike will fail. There's actually a certain probability that the bike will fail more than once. So I need to include that in my model, and then I need to have a model which will be based on data on how long it's going to take me to fix it and get back on a bike and cycling again. Same with meeting people. Is it going to happen? Is it not going to happen? And how long is it going to take place for? So this is the sort of gray zone. Now, sometimes, usually at a sort of stakeholder level, a senior management level, we'll have a conversation about what are the data that we're going to use to do this. So in my bike fail case, it's just saying, okay, how long has it taken in the past to fix these things? In the meeting case, it's the same. In the win cases, I'm looking at publicly available information here. The next step, where we say, okay, well, how do we model that? What distributions are we going to use? How are we going to parameterize those distributions? That's something that we usually will take in a sort of project team at a sort of smaller level, with people who can, have the time and maybe the background to be meaningfully contributing to those discussions. Excuse me. Just for my fellow nerds out there, just very briefly running through the distributions that I'm using here. The bike fail is Poisson because it could happen more than once. Meeting, I'm saying if I meet someone, then I'm just going to get on my bike and head to work. So it's not going to happen more than once. So it's a binary thing. I'm using Weibull distributions here, which are quite nice for these sorts of things, because you can talk about in the Weibull context as to failure rate. It's saying, when does the light bulb fail? But in this case, it's a question of, it's a sort of success rate. It's like, when do I stop finishing the bike and when do I stop talking? And essentially that rate increases. The probability of me finishing one of these things increases with time up to sort of critical point. So I can model that quite straightforward. And I find actually that fits the data quite well, insofar as I have data. And I'll be absolutely honest, I haven't punted so many times that I have that much data. Met people quite a lot, so I have quite a lot of data on that. Wind speeds are Weibull distributed. That's out there in the literature. That fits the data very well. Wind direction is a little bit tricky. People don't specify directions, they just give empirical data. You can do empirical distributions, but what I've done is a sort of von Mises, which is a kind of circular normal distribution. We have two prevailing wind directions in Denmark, one which comes from the side and which comes straight into my face when I'm cycling to work. Luckily, the one that comes straight in my face we don't see so often, but it's there. So I've fitted those two distributions, blended those probability of distributions are fitted into the wind data. The power model I've talked about, traffic lights, just a very simple model. Luckily, my traffic lights are red, so the probability, traffic lights are independent, so the probability of me hitting a red is independent when I go from one. I have 3 separate lights, and they're all independent. And it's just a very simple question of, what's the probability of me hitting them, and what's the length of time that I sit there. So that's my model, and then what I do is I run this model, and essentially what I'm doing is I'm saying I've specified distribution, so like for yes or no, and then some sort of severity. So what I do is I say, okay, I'm going to make 10,000 calculations of the time it takes me to get to work. For each of those calculations, I'm going to take one possible value of all of these things based on the distributions, the mathematical descriptions that I have, so that across all 10,000, each of these distributions will be honored. But for any one of those 10,000 iterations, it's just one choice of variable. So, for example, I run the first distribution. Does the bike fail? Yes, it does. Oops. Okay. How long am I sitting off the bike? Fine. Do I meet? No, I don't. How long am I sitting on the bike? Excuse me, it picks a wind speed, it picks a wind direction, and then I say, okay, so what's the resolved wind? And then it says, was it out drinking, was it sleeping? That chooses the power that I use in my model, and I work all this through, and then I come to I get a departure time. Sorry, I get a travel time, and then I go to the next one. So the next one, the bike didn't fail, didn't meet anyone. Excuse me. Excuse me, different wind speed, different wind direction, do the calculation again. I do the calculation lots and lots and lots and lots of times. And what I end up with is a sort of distribution over how long it takes me to get to work. And what I can see here is that it takes me, mostly it takes me around 22, 23 minutes. I think the average is 23. What I said I'm interested in is actually the point at which 80% of the time I take less time to get to work, and that's actually 26 minutes. So what I know is that if I leave 26 minutes before 8, which is when I'm supposed to be at work, then I will only be late 20% of the time, which is roughly about once a week. And then I can say, okay, well, let's look at these things out on the right here, these late arrivals. I can see that it can get very late. Now these events out here are very strong winds, or in about half the time it's the bike fail or meeting people. But if I take an average over this, what I say, it's actually only 5 minutes on average. Yes, there are some exceptional cases, but it's really only 5 minutes. So I can ask a lot of sort of questions like, what time do I need to leave in order to be late once a week? I could turn that down. If I said I only wanted to be late once a month, I could ask that question very easily. I can ask questions about averages and things like that. I can ask questions about, maybe I want to get rid of these, the low end things that I don't leave too early. So I can sort of optimize from the other side. So there's a lot of sort of flexibility and a lot of things that we can do, and we'll explore those in a little bit more detail now. I mentioned earlier this thing about conditioning, about sort of monitoring, react, and respond. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to say, all right, well, I get up in the morning, I look on my phone, I check the weather forecast, and I can see the wind is coming from a certain direction, I can see it's having a certain speed. So what I can then do is I can build that into the model. So instead of just sampling from a distribution here and sampling from a distribution here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, right, I know what the wind speed is and I know what the wind direction is. I'm going to put that in and then say, what does the model look like now? And what I can see then is that it's shifting over, the wind's in my face, so it's going to take me longer to get to work. The average shifts up like 4 or 5 minutes, and I can see that I actually have to leave half an hour early if I want to make sure that I'm at work, at least not more than, if I'm late, not more than once a week. We'll get back to that conditioning in a couple of slides time. Powerful model, very useful, very much sort of taking its point of departure in what I'm trying to achieve, going to work on time, and the things that I can do about that, which in this case is departure time, but as we'll come on to, there are other things that I can do to influence that. I'm going to talk a little bit about how this is risk management. It's quite fun. I've been talking now 2.5 workshops, and it's only just now that I'm actually getting to talk about risk management. But actually what I would argue is that what I've been doing all the way through here, even though sometimes I call it strategy, sometimes I call it risk management, sometimes I call it decision support, sometimes when the decisions are on-off investment decisions, I call it portfolio analysis. It's all the same thing, but it's all essentially risk management. And it's very easy to sort of pull in the vocabulary of risk management and overlay the structure of these models. Now, when I do this, you can do that. I'm not sure why you'd need to do that, or why you'd want to do that, because in a sense, the sort of nuance and the flexibility of allowing a certain amount of fluidity between what to trigger and what to risk, what to consequence cause, that sort of thing. Just understanding those relationships is the key thing. Giving them names is maybe a little bit arbitrary. But I recognize very clearly that a lot of people coming to this from a traditional risk management perspective will need that mapping, both for their own sort of benefit and to be able to sort of engage with these things, but very much in terms of sort of dealing with stakeholders who are used to that sort of risk management vocabulary and want to see it. And obviously, in a lot of cases, there's legislative requirements that you speak about risk using a certain vocabulary. So what we're doing now is sort of just importing the risk vocabulary into this thing and seeing how they map. Now, risk in a sort of ISO 31000 context, that's uncertainties that affect your outcomes. Well, my outcome is here, and all of these things are uncertain in the sense that they're stochastic. They have a range on them, and they're affecting the outcome just because they're linked causally to the arrival time, which is my outcome. I would argue that maybe at this level, these things are sort of intermediary variables. And I think in a sort of ISO 31000 context, it's these things that we would be talking about as risk. Now, straight traditional event-based risk management, you say something goes wrong, how does it affect us? These two things, the bike fail, the puncture, and the random meeting, they very much fall into that category. That's a sort of, it's either there or it's not, and if it is there, it has an effect. These things are slightly less often traditionally treated in a risk management context, although they very much ought to be. This is the more sort of continuous variables, things that are always there. There's always a wind. It might be a headwind, it might be a tailwind, it might be no wind at all, but there's always some kind of wind, and there's a sort of continuous range of outcomes here. So these things that sort of map onto the more sort of continuous variables that we do in the risk management, like, for example, commodity price, currency exchange rates, interest rates, that sort of thing. And these things are more the sort of the internal components that we need to think about. And I would argue very strongly that these, if you're doing risk management, if you're dealing with uncertainties and outcomes, these are very, very important, very often actually more important for certain metrics, for certain forms of goal than the event risks. So these are my risks. And what's very nice about having risks in this sort of context is that you understand what's affecting those risks. It's a sort of instant bow tie, if you like. And again, it's very easy to map these things into a bow tie context, and that's quite a powerful thing to do in some respects. Or likewise, we can go the other way. We can go from bow tie to this kind of diagram. And these are the sorts of things that we can keep an eye on and use to generate monitor and respond type policies, and things that we can look at to see what we can, how we can manage the risk in a sort of operational context. There are also things that we can use to understand how to manage these risks in a more nuanced way. We have controls as well. Obviously, my primary control here is simply what time I leave for work, but also I can do maintenance. I can make sure I can invest time and money to make sure that the bike doesn't fail. And one of the beauties of this approach, this quantitative approach, and this is something you can only do in a quantitative approach, is you can really sort of cost-benefit analyze this. So you can put that in, you can put the cost in into your model, and you can see how much it actually you benefit from it, obviously in a statistical sense, in a probabilistic sense, but there's a lot of methodology that you can use to answer meaningful questions about whether those interventions are worth it, or perhaps more relevantly, what is the level of intervention that's appropriate for achieving your objectives. So let's look at these a little bit. I've talked a little bit about this react and respond scenario. Before I talk about it, I'll talk a little bit about prioritization. Now, clearly, in a traditional risk management context, we would be trying to prioritize these things, and we do that in a quantitative context as well. The way we look at it is slightly different. So what we'll do here is we'll take each of these risks and say, okay, so if it's bad, what does it look like? And if it's good, what does it look like? And this is kind of interesting because it might be that we have here we have a tailwind. So I did that the wrong way around. This is the tailwind. This is the tailwind. This is good. It's time. So this is good. This is bad. So we have a tailwind, but we can still have a meeting. So and those will be factored into it. So it's saying what is the influence of of each individual component, given that the other components are sort of just doing their thing, by and by. So what this is saying is that, when I have a good tailwind, this is my sort of average, and that's still affected by these things, but that's this kind of average. And when I have a headwind, this is the average here. So you can see how much those individual components are actually affecting my outcome. What we can see is wind speed is really important. Running into people can really delay me. So when that goes bad, it doesn't go bad that often, and that's not really reflected in this thing. So here, meeting and failing look pretty bad in the sense that when they happen, when it's bad, it's very, very bad. But they don't actually happen that often. So in terms of metrics like coming to work on time, not more than coming to work on time 80% of the time, they don't actually have that big a role. So, and again, the quantitative analysis allows you to ask those questions and answer those questions with a lot of detail and a lot of nuance, and you can always sort of switch things on and off and take them out, put them in, and see what the difference is. So now talking about policies, we're talking about react and respond policies. This is me looking at my iPhone, seeing where the wind is coming from, how strong it's moving, and then adjusting my departure time as a consequence. And that's what a policy essentially is. It's a react and respond policy. It establishes a causal relation between something that you can observe and something that you can control. So what I do here is I say, well, okay, I know what my model is for speed. I know how wind speed affects my speed. So I'm going to make a very simple model here. I'm just going to make a very sort of simple relationship between a resolved wind speed and the time I need to leave. And then I can incorporate that policy into my model and I can see what effect it has had. And what it does is it narrows the range a little bit because I'm controlling one of the uncertainties. It shifts the peak a little bit closer to my sort of ideal time to leave, which is the time that I need to leave in order not to be late more than once a week. But actually, in terms of the really interesting metric here is that it doesn't actually affect that much. I'm slightly less likely to, it's slightly less than once a week that I'm now coming, but it doesn't make a huge difference. And that's quite of interesting. And I don't think that's intuitive. That's the sort of insight that a model like this can give you. Yeah, something else I can do, very similar ideas. I can say, okay, well, let's look at the maintenance. I talked about this a little bit earlier. Let's do some maintenance. We know what it costs. Let's do some maintenance to see how much difference it makes. And this is very interesting. It seems to make very little difference at all. And the reason it makes very little difference at all is because the bike doesn't puncture that much, even without the maintenance or the extra maintenance. I don't puncture that often, so it actually doesn't make any difference. It makes the difference out here. I'm much less likely to turn up more than 15 minutes late if I do the maintenance. I'm about half as likely to turn up 15 minutes late if I do the maintenance. And that's because it's only really out here that the maintenance is feeling its effect. So if I was really caring about that piece, then then I might want to think about doing maintenance. And obviously that's the sort of questions you can answer. And in an oil and gas context, for example, this would be all of the very hard work that we do to avoid those disasters, because we never want to be out in the long disaster tail in an oil and gas context. So it's always worth doing those sorts of things. Whereas in this particular case, as soon as I have 15 minutes, I'm getting hammered for that anyway. So, whether or not it's 15 minutes or 30 minutes, it doesn't really matter too much. So actually, maybe this maintenance isn't worth it for me on my bike. Now I'm going to talk about traditional risk management. I'm straw manning the risk matrix a little bit. Risk matrix comes in for an awful lot of abuse, most of it thoroughly well deserved. I've written extensively on LinkedIn about how we can sort of use risk matrix, how we can sort of take what risk matrices are trying to do and move it over into this sort of context. But I just want to sort of run through some of the sort of difficulties, some of the reason I think that people who have access to these kind of quantitative methods have a lot of discomfort about the risk matrix. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to take my risks here and map them into a risk matrix. And here we run up against one of the first problems, one of the things that really sort of, I think makes a lot of people very uncomfortable about heat maps. Something like wind speed. Now I can see from my tornado diagram back here that the wind speed has quite a significant effect. It can save me sort of 6 to 7 minutes, and it can delay me by even more. But what is not absolutely clear is so, I mean, we need to have some sort of a sense of what that severity should be. Is it a sort of best case? Is it a sort of mid case? Is it a high case? Well, if it's a high case, then you can easily delay me by 10 minutes. Um, but so if I say, okay, so what's probability of me getting into the 10-minute box? And I can see that happens actually, about a third of the time. Sorry, to get me to 10 minutes, I need to be over 5 minutes, and that happens about a third of the time. But actually, to get me into, I could even go into the 15-minute box, and that would bring me down into here. So there's a whole sort of question about where on the outcome severity axis I should be putting myself, and then obviously the probability response to that as well. And because of the sort of breadth of these ranges, and I've even made this range relatively linear, so it's not even that broad. Because of the breadth of the ranges, you end up actually being able to argue for quite a lot of different places on the risk map. Now it turns out form doesn't have that much effect. That was quite an interesting result that comes straight out of the physical model, and it's because the amount of work that you have to put in to go a little bit faster is quite a lot, because there's a strong dependence between power and speed. And what that means is that even the contrary of that is that if your power is reduced, it doesn't actually reduce your speed that much. So form doesn't actually make that much difference, strangely. It feels like a lot of difference, but that's just how you feel. It's not actually making that much difference to the time it takes to get to work. And it turns out that form mostly sort of affects you between 1 and 5 minutes. So it sits quite comfortably in this box. And actually those form events have a relatively well-described probability. So that is an event that can be relatively, comfortably plotted into a map. The problem with it, though, is that this range, 5 to 25%, is a huge range. So in terms of impact, this is a huge range of weighted impact, risk-rated impact. And actually, this box is going from 1 minute to 5 minutes. So it's a factor of 4. So it's a factor of 4 and a factor of 5. So a factor of 20 in terms of weighted impact here. So I can locate it quite well, but it's difficult really to understand what it's telling me in terms of the ultimate impact on my arrival time. Now, bike fail, we get into something very interesting here. The bike fail, it fails about 1% of the time, and it can delay me from anything from sort of 5 or 6 minutes through to half an hour, depending on the failure. And again, so according to the choice, am I taking a sort of best case? Am I taking an average? Am I taking a high case? The probability of all of those things is under 1%, so I could quite happily put them in any of these boxes here. And the thing with meeting is exactly the same. Now, meeting is a lot more often. I think I meet sort of once every couple of weeks, and the probability actually of getting out to a really substantial delay from meeting is not yet under 1%. It's quite close to 1%. It's not yet under 1%. So actually the meet risk I could put in any of these boxes here, which means that, my policy for dealing with it, which ranges from doing nothing to burn the house down. And this, I think, is one of the huge problems with heat maps. And I've written about this on a LinkedIn article a couple of months ago. The fact that just from a sort of mathematical point of view, if you try to take these things even remotely seriously as quantitative measures of severity and quantitative measures of likelihood of reaching that severity, you get yourself in a lot of trouble. There's a huge amount of range on these things, and you have to be very specific about what it is that you're trying to plot in terms of the severity, which of those severity outcomes it is. And of course, if you choose one of those things, then you lose information on all of the others. The work of doing this is comparable, I think, to the work of doing getting the information you need, understanding the data, passing the data. These things, when you have the machinery, and the machinery is available, and in many cases it's freely available, these things aren't that difficult. And insofar as they are difficult, they're saving you a lot of head scratching and a lot of often quite heated discussions about where these things should be sitting. And it's quite an interesting sort of factor, sort of component in risk management, is that the more ambiguous and difficult the methodology, the more the politics really sort of enters into it, and these things become very political and very heated and sometimes quite acrimonious. Whereas a methodology that has a more rigorous relationship to data, it's very much easier to sort of keep that clean and keep that, insofar as possible and reasonable, objective and independent. Now, once we've plotted these things in a risk map, then we need to do things like looking at the gross risk, so that's the risk without additional mitigation. And really now I just have colors. I mean, I can't really do anything more than that. And I've seen the colors are sort of grading a little bit here because I'm not absolutely sure what they should be. And then I have some of my mitigation, and because I'm not doing the quantitative model, I have to sort of guess a little bit about what time I should be leaving for work. So I'd take some kind of average, and that's going to make me late about a little bit less than half the time. It's not good enough, so my mitigation there is to leave early. But the funny thing about that is that that doesn't actually change the position on the risk matrix at all. Wherever I put the wind risk here, what leaving early will do is pop it down, but they all at most pop down one box, and the residual risk is exactly the same from a sort of color calculus point of view. Form I can improve. I can just say to myself, all right, I'm not going to go out in town the night before I go to work, and I'm going to have, I don't know, maybe I sell my kids or something, but I'm going to do something about the sleep, maybe share it a little bit more equitably with my wife, and reduce that probability a bit more, and I can actually sort of get that down to the sort of under 5%, and I can turn yellow to green. But actually, when you run that analysis on the quantitative side, that doesn't make very much difference to the outcome at all. So what you're seeing here is a heat map that's saying, yep, this is a good thing to do. This makes it yellow green, and that improves our risk profile. Whereas in reality, it's not really having any problem at all. We've already looked at maintenance, and we've seen that it doesn't have any make any difference. But what it does here is it gets rid of the yellow risks for me, because it essentially rapidly reduces the chance of failing. But again, quantitative point of view, we see that doesn't help. So, this traditional analysis is telling us to do things that actually don't make any difference, and it's not telling us, and it's telling us that we don't need to do things that actually do make quite a big difference. And that, to my mind, is one of the big problems of this thing. To be honest, there's a lot of hate for this process, and I understand a lot of what motivates it and a lot of what people are trying to achieve with it. I think maybe my message here is that this can be a little bit hairy. It can look a little bit intimidating. It can look quite complex in its full glory. But actually, we're at this level, which is the level that most people will have to engage with it at. And even at this level, if we're just looking at the data sources and how we're going to describe those relationships, it's a kind of storytelling that allows people to understand what is playing a role, what's important, what's not so important. Understand how we expect to use information and expertise to understand the relationships between those two things, and ultimately and critically, and the most important thing, understand how, when we change things, when we make interventions, when we change decisions, when we distribute resources, when we choose to do investments or not do investments, how all of those decisions propagate through those uncertainties and affect the outcome. That level of analysis, that level of discussion is accessible, it's insightful, and it gives people a sense of real understanding about what's going on. The last couple of steps, which aren't straightforward, but that are something that one can outsource to people who know how to do it, they take you that final step and allow you to look at sort of figures like this and ask very meaningful questions about, how we trade off probabilities of certain things happening and certain things not happening, certain desirable things happening against cost, and certain undesirable things happening against, reducing that against cost. Those sort of questions. What I hope I've demonstrated today with this very simple example is that those questions are easy to ask, and they're relatively easy to answer when we have these models in place. That whole machinery is, I think, and I've had a fair amount of experience with both of these things, it's maybe not easier than this, but the process is an awful lot more comfortable. And the reason the process is a lot more comfortable is because you don't have that ambiguity. You're making choices in the other. You're making modeling choices. You're making choices about granularity, you're making choices about what to leave in and leave out. But you don't have that ambiguity where there are actually, quite a lot of equally valid interpretations And then, of course, there's a lot of agenda about which interpretation gets them on at the end of the day. So just a final slide here, just the takeaways. This is actually the takeaway slide from all of my presentations today. I'm trying to introduce this method, causal mapping, combined with stochastic modeling. It's goal-oriented, it's actionable, it's all about the decisions we make and the objectives we're trying to achieve. It's predictive. It's not enough just to establish relationships. That's something we can use artificial intelligence, machine learning for, but this is something where we want to build people's understanding. Your own understanding of your own company needs to be part of this model. It's not enough just to let a machine come at it and look at it and go, "Ooh, you should do this." It's saying, okay, this is what we know. These are the data that we have that we can, use to hold ourselves up against reality. And this is what that model that we've got from doing that tells us. It's intuitive, it's accessible. The causal mapping is a very powerful tool. It gets you very, very close to the mathematical model, so close that actually people are generally quite comfortable leaving the final steps to an outside expert or to an internal expert, if that's where if you have one. But the main bulk of that modeling is accessible to everyone, and it's a very rich and insightful process to run through that. It's scalable. You can use this for simple everyday decisions through to very large 5-year strategies for a company, and I've done all of those, and it is that scalable. And that scalability also works within a model. It allows you to roll things up to a high level and roll things out to the sort of, to be able to get individual insights and detail into the model if that's warranted, if that's necessary. And it's data driven. So, I've said a couple of times in this that modeling is essentially a form of storytelling. What's nice about it is that story is not just a story I make up, it's a story that I make up and then take out into the world and say, does it hang together? And if it doesn't hang together, I change the story until it does hang together. And that's a very powerful component of this, because otherwise we're just waving our hands around. And what this is doing is saying, no, we're taking our point of departure in what we're deciding, what we're trying to achieve, and what the world actually looks like. Thank you very much for your attention. If you haven't seen the other 2 workshops, then please you can go in and download them and look at them in your own time. Any questions, please write them down, write them to me now, and we'll get to those as quickly as possible and get back to you. And of course, if you have any questions or want to discuss any of this with me, then my email is on the website. Please feel free to reach out at any time. Thank you very much.